let's see if that continues into part 3. Spoilers, yes. But yes, what's the last part of the Back to the Future trilogy about then, Drew?
Roads. Where we are going, we don't need roads. Though there are railroads and tracks. Look, just shush. The reason we don't need roads is because we're going to the Doc's favourite era, the Old West, and horses don't need roads. Though they may travel more quickly along them, but A, I don't know about horses, and B, shut up. After the events of the end of part 2, we find... Oh, well, sorry, we didn't actually talk about the end of that. So the end of part 2, the DeLorean explodes because it hit by lightning, just as Marty's about to go back to the future. So, he's a bit stuck in 1955. So after the end of that, and the courier arriving in the middle of the road with a letter he's had for 70 years to deliver to him, we find Marty and the Doc back at the Doc's house where, after convincing the Doc that Marty is really there, the duo recovers the DeLorean from the old mine in which it has been stored since 1885 to send Marty back home. While doing this, though, they discover that Doc Brown is going to die a few days after his letter was written, so Marty has to make a stop in the 19th century before he can finally return to his 1985 life. Back in 1885, Marty adopts the moniker Clint Eastwood. What a stupid name for a cowboy. Meets up with the Doc, other McFlys, Tannins and Stricklands, and generally risks messing up the space-time continuum again. Though this time it's Doc Brown who's the biggest danger to that, falling in love as he does with Mary Steenburgen's Clara. The plot isn't a great deal different from the first film, and the fish out of water stuff works in a similar way, so part 3 is understandably less good than the first. But it's always been my second favourite of the trilogy, perhaps in large part due to the western setting. It retains an extremely well constructed screenplay with lots of payoffs to things subtly set up in part 2 in particular, such as Marty being a crack shot and a reference to a fistful of dollars. Though by this point in the trilogy, while it's still a great deal of fun, the film is certainly suffering from diminishing returns, and some of the elements seem very forced, most obviously the presence of Leah Thompson as part of Marty's family in 1885. She's there for the running joke, and probably for a degree of fairness, loyalty, but her role is either very silly or very icky, depending on how you view it. But it's less goofy than the first half of part 2, though it does unfortunately carry on that film's most awkward new idea that, out of nowhere, Marty now can't abide being called chicken. That never sat well with me. Other than that, though, I still heartily enjoy it. Oh, apart from the creepy wee kid pointing at his junk. I mean, that kid's creepy enough, but then he's pointing at his junk. Why? What are you doing, child? It's weird.
In my memory, part 3 is always the one I like the least, but I think looking at them again, I actually like them all just as much as each other. I don't really want to separate them all that much.
Yeah.
I think when I'm thinking about it, in the abstract, having not seen it for a while, I think it's the one where they're not exactly running out of ideas, but they're kind of getting there. It's like, well, they've done the future, they've done the past, further in the past. That's fine, and kind of thrown together that way. But that's doing it a disservice because, again, it is still a very cleverly written script. Perhaps less so in terms of the way that the second one could dance around the first one, or just the kind of whole concept of the first one in the first place. So the third one, I suppose, as you mentioned, kind of diminishing returns, it is perhaps the least interesting in a kind of abstract kind of sense to it. But when actually watching to it, it's just as funny as all the other ones. And frankly, that's all you should really be caring about in a comedy. So I got just as many laughs out of this one as I did out of the other two. And some of my actual favourites, the final, it's a small moment, but after 2 3/4 films of Doc Brown exclaiming "Great Scott" and Bart McFly saying, "Oh, it's heavy,"
yeah.
Having those switch round just for that one instance is hilarious. Works incredibly well. Just delivered absolutely spectacularly by both men. So yeah, it works very well in that regard. I don't really want to be drawn too much in kind of ranking them. I think they're all worthwhile. I think it is a rare case of a trilogy where every one of them works and is, I could recommend without caveats, and there's precious few films that make it to 3 films where you can't see some kind of precipitous drop-off in quality at some point. So yes, this certainly deserves to be bought as part of the box set and watched all in one run rather than maybe just politely ignoring one of them. So, yeah, it is incredibly funny for all the same reasons that the first two were, without going over it too much. But yes, the actors bring the same amount of energy as I suppose would be sensible, given that they were all kind of filmed at the same time. Not even back to back, I guess. For a lot of it, it was actually kind of there's a bit of crossover and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's all of that works particularly well. The characters are by this point are kind of set in stone and really quite iconic by this point, and just continue on with that kind of energy and enthusiasm. So it all works really well. Trailing off because I'm not sure I've got much more of a point to it other than to say that I like it. I'm not a massive fan of westerns, so the setting is perhaps one of the less interesting ones for me.
Yeah, that was in my mind when I was saying that, because I really like westerns. That's one of the reasons I really like that setting. But I was aware that you said recently you'd sort of come round to westerns, but I know you've never been a big fan of them.
Yes, certainly historically, I've never been much of a fan of the western or the era. I don't have any kind of interest or romance in that kind of era of American culture. But in terms of how it needs to be done for this kind of film, it all works particularly well because it's not really a western. It's also not actually a pastiche. It still remains kind of fairly not reverential to the kind of western ethos, but it pays it more than enough service to not be taken just as a joke. Again, in common with all the other ones, it ploughs enough of the kind of furrow of being serious enough with what it's trying to do without actually being ridiculous. Although I do think perhaps one of the better visual cutaways in this series is the kind of when they're going back to 1885 and having to go drive at the drive-through wall, which has inscriptions of Native Americans charging in a war band at it, and saying, "Oh, in the past there won't be Indians there," and then of course there are. Predictable, perhaps, but yes, it is a great little cutaway moment, and one of many of the series, and a fitting end to a series. It's all on. It's remained of high quality all the way throughout, and yes, another fun film to watch and heartily recommended.
Yeah. 2 and 3 definitely benefit from having been shot together, but there's a cohesiveness to the whole thing that you wouldn't necessarily believe that it had been shot all together. But that you could easily believe they had been written as a trilogy. Whereas lots of other trilogies that were always meant to be a trilogy quite clearly weren't. They just weren't. Whereas this, you could believe it. And there's so many lovely little running jokes too, but they don't overplay any one of them. Yeah. And there's some that you feel is actually in there a lot, but it's not. I think one of my favourite jokes is only in there twice, I think. So you can't even count that as a joke.
Model?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's there in the first and the third, and it's almost how I introduced part 3, Scott. I very nearly said, my apologies for the crudeness of this recap, but yes, I know it's not to scale, and I haven't had time to paint it, but yes. I just love that. There's the real wealth of material there. As you mentioned about buying the box set too, for its 35th anniversary last year, it was released on 4K UHD Blu-ray, which I have, and it looks amazing. I've actually seen, I think I must have seen 6 or 7 different versions of this now, at least, clips of it at least, mostly thanks to Techmon. I think he's a big fan of this film because when he's doing VCDs and all the other various old film formats, home video formats, he's very often showing that Japanese Laserdisc compared to US Laserdisc and the VHS and stuff, and the 4K UHD transfer is extremely good. I was so impressed by the transfer they've got out of that. The film looks better than it's ever done before. So, if you have the facility to play back those, I certainly urge you to check those out. But even back when we were watching VHS in the 1980s, it was amazingly fun, so that's all that really matters.
Yes. And it contains perhaps my favourite ZZ Top track. Double back one that they're playing in the
my favourite ZZ Top track.
And only one that I know.
The only one that I know or care to know, yes, that's right. How did you know I was going to say that? Yeah, it really stands the test of time. Not a pun. Well, it is a pun, but it wasn't an intended one. it's just a great deal of fun, this film, and it really stands up well. The only thing I think is that possibly younger people are going to watch this and kind of not realise why 1955 looks so weird when 1985 is going to look quite weird to them anyway.
Yeah.
But for everybody else, you're probably fine with that. And certainly if you've seen it before, just like, you be assured it stands up. If you liked this in the past, I'm quite sure you're going to like it still now, but you should watch it again because it's great.
Absolutely.